Karen always tried to keep her household routine in order. Despite the challenges of being a single mother, she worked as a receptionist at a medium-sized dental practice in Detroit, and, on weekends, worked extra shifts at a small restaurant in the neighborhood to supplement her income. Her life wasn't easy, but she considered herself fortunate to have her 8-year-old son, Peter, as her main motivation. Ever since his father left without looking back, Karen had faced the world alone. Even so, she harbored a constant hope that things would get better. However, everything changed when Peter started complaining of body pains that came and went with no apparent explanation. At first, Karen thought it was just muscle pain or a more persistent cold. But as the weeks went by, the pains became more frequent, and the boy was extremely tired and almost always pale. The doctor at the local health center suggested more detailed tests, worried that something serious might be going on. During the first consultations, Karen tried not to despair. Those more complex blood tests seemed routine for some cases, and she clung to the hope that Peter just had some more severe anemia. But after going back and forth to the hospital for almost 2 weeks, she received the news that floored her. Her son had been diagnosed with a serious and potentially fatal illness if it wasn't treated urgently. The hospital staff referred her to a specialist in the children's ward, and there it became clear that she would have to deal with astronomical costs. Even using the basic health insurance she had, many of the costs would not be covered. In the waiting room, while Peter played absent-mindedly with a small electronic game lent to him by a nurse, Karen talked to the doctor in charge, Dr. Nicholson. He explained objectively what was happening to the boy, detailing that long treatments, frequent examinations, expensive medication and possibly more invasive procedures would be needed in the future. Karen felt a pang of anguish with each piece of information. Even in the face of the facts, she tried to remain calm so as not to frighten Peter. "I can't afford all this," she admitted, her voice breaking. "The insurance I pay for doesn't cover much of what you're talking about." The doctor, who seemed used to delicate situations, tried to maintain a professional attitude. "There are some assistance programs and philanthropic entities that can help you. But approval usually takes time, and his case requires immediate intervention. If there are any relatives who can help or any emergency reserves, it's essential to start treatment without delay." Karen took a deep breath. There were no relatives who could lend a hand. After her mother had died, she had been left without a support network. She thought of friends, but knew that no one had enough money to pay for something this big. Her job barely covered the basic bills, and she still had to provide for Peter during his treatment. That night at home, Karen paced back and forth in the living room. Peter was asleep in his room, tired from another day of tests and trips to the hospital. The noise of a cheap heater crackled in the corner, trying to warm the apartment up a little. It was early February and very cold in Detroit. She grabbed some papers that listed the average costs of treatment, just an already frightening forecast. She had no idea where she would get the money. She looked around. The few things of value she owned were a television, bought on sale, and some second-hand furniture, nothing that came close to the amount needed. She wondered if it would be worth selling the car, but she hadn't had one for months. She had sold it to pay off rent arrears. There was one thing, however, that she kept very carefully, a gold necklace that had belonged to her mother. Since childhood, she had seen it glitter around her mother's neck as a symbol of strength. It was simple, with no precious stones, but it was the only real heirloom left from her mother's memory. Karen had never considered selling it. However, now she remembered that this necklace was made of pure gold, something that could at least help with immediate expenses. She picked up the small box that held the jewel. When she opened it, she saw the thin chain that her mother had worn until the last days of her life. The yellowish shine of the metal still seemed intact, as if it were brand new. As she stared at it, she recalled memorable moments, her mother taking her to school, cooking simple but tasty dishes, giving her advice on cold winter nights. That jewel was the physical connection that remained between them. Karen realized she was crying, but in the midst of her tears, she decided that she had to be strong. She had to do everything in her power to save Peter's life. The next morning, she called the office where she worked and informed them that she wouldn't be able to make it. She carefully wrapped the necklace in a cloth, put it in the box, and got Peter ready for another day of tests at the hospital. Before leaving, she left her son in the children's ward, as a group of nurses would be looking after him while she dealt with urgent matters. It was hard to leave him there, but she didn't see any other option at the moment. She had to at least try to get some money. She took a cab to get to the city center more quickly. After a while, she stopped in front of a relatively well-known pawn shop in the area. The lettering on the sign was a little worn, and the reinforced shop windows displayed a wide variety of objects, from old guitars to luxury watches. Karen hesitated for a moment, looking at the movement in the street. People were rushing past, and she felt she was about to make a very difficult decision. However, her desperation to help Peter spoke louder than any material or sentimental attachment. She entered the store, feeling the warm air clash with the cold coming from the street. The room was cramped and had a faint smell of metal and old wood. Behind a glass counter with several pieces of jewelry and watches on display stood a man in a worn suit with an attentive gaze. He raised his head, assessing Karen from head to toe before asking if she needed any help. I need to sell a piece of jewelry, Karen said, swallowing. It's a gold necklace. The store owner, whose name tag read S. Davis, gave her a slight sign to show her the object. Karen opened the small box and carefully took out the necklace. He took the chain, examined it with a small magnifying glass, and, from time to time, scratched the metal on a touchstone to check its authenticity. It's good quality gold, he admitted, without looking away, but it has no stones or distinctive design. It's very simple. What's its price? Karen stammered. I don't really know. All I know is that it's pure gold, and it's very important to me. I need money urgently. My son is ill, and the cost of treatment... She stopped speaking, her voice breaking. The man looked at her with a countenance that was a mixture of compassion and skepticism. Used to seeing all kinds of clients, he had probably heard similar stories. Even so, he didn't show much emotion. He consulted a table behind the counter, wrote something down on a calculator, and finally took a deep breath. I can offer you $500. That's a good price for a fine chain like that. Karen blinked, stunned. She had expected more. It wasn't a small sum in general terms, but it would be derisory compared to the thousands of dollars she would have to pay to the hospital. She explained the situation further, saying that she needed more money, but he got straight to the point. I'm sorry, I can't pay any more than that. As you yourself noticed, the chain doesn't have any stones or details to enhance the piece. It's just the weight of the gold, and even so, it's a fine piece of jewelry. If you want to try another store, feel free, but I doubt they'll pay much more. The price on the market hasn't been so high lately. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked at the necklace, remembering her mother. That object was all she had of value. As much as it hurt to let go, she would consider accepting it if it was the only way to get some money now. However, $500 wouldn't even come close to the initial amount the hospital demanded to cover the treatment. Even so, she wanted to at least confirm whether there was any possibility of offering more. There's nothing... She began, her voice shaking, but then fell silent. She saw S. Davis' expression, a mixture of experience and the coldness of someone who has been in this business for a long time. Then she tried to maintain her dignity. I can't... She stopped again, taking a deep breath. Can't what? Asked the man, with a slight tone of impatience. Karen lowered her gaze to the necklace. She ran her hand along the chain, as if she could feel her mother's presence there. That moment seemed worse than any embarrassment she had ever experienced in her life. It was as if she was selling not just an object, but a part of her history. She thought about Peter, his condition and the risk he was taking. She would complete the sale if she really had to. But even that now seemed pointless. $500 wouldn't ease the situation much. "I think I need to think about it," said Karen, her voice breaking. "This isn't going to be enough for my son's treatment. I don't know what to do." The store owner nodded in understanding, but didn't change his offer. "I'm sorry about your situation, but for the necklace, it's the most I can pay." Karen remained silent for a few seconds, still trying to digest the lack of alternatives. She wished she wasn't there. At the same time, she knew she couldn't afford to refuse any financial help, no matter how small. All this was bringing out a desperation that she couldn't contain. She had to find another way, some light at the end of the tunnel that could guarantee Peter's urgent treatment. She held the necklace in the palm of her hand, mentally weighing up what it would mean to sell it for so little. The atmosphere seemed colder than it should have been, and all she could do was stare at the store owner's impassive face and try to find a minimally acceptable way out. When he finally opened his mouth to reply, his voice came out almost in a whisper. "It's nowhere near enough. I really am desperate. But if that's what you can offer..." She didn't finish her sentence. The man continued with a neutral expression, waiting for her decision. Outside, the noise of cars driving up and down the avenue mixed with the slight hum of the indoor heater, and it was at that moment that Karen realized that, even if she sold the necklace, she would still be practically at zero in terms of the costs she would face. Her eyes watered. She had to act, but she didn't know how. A lump in her throat prevented her from saying any more. In her mind, she relived the last conversation she'd had with the doctor. "It's important to start treatment soon. Every day can make a difference." That's what he'd said. And what could she do now? Karen hadn't yet handed the necklace over to the store owner. She held it tightly as she searched for the strength to give her final answer, and her desperation was at an all-time high. She tried hard not to cry openly, but she couldn't hold back a tear that ran down her cheek. She desperately needed a solution, but none was forthcoming. She opened her hand and saw the chain slip lightly between her fingers. The memory of her mother was mixed with fear for Peter. In an act of sheer despondency, she lowered her head. The store owner, for his part, said nothing. He seemed used to distressed customers, but he also knew that he couldn't come up with a higher price than the market dictated. The necklace, once a sign of affection, now became a symbol of his powerlessness. And there, in that small, dark-walled establishment, she knew for sure that she was alone against a giant problem. If she accepted the money, she would still fall short of the amount she needed. If she didn't, she would waste more time looking for a solution that didn't exist. Then, holding the necklace, she turned to the counter. Her heart was pounding and her breathing was ragged, making it clear how nervous she was. She had nowhere else to run. The store owner, S. Davis, maintained the same neutral expression as he waited for her answer. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to accept the $500 and believe that somehow it would make a difference. But the truth was, it wouldn't. It wouldn't even come close to the amount she needed to save Peter. She looked around, as if hoping to find a magical way out of her predicament. It was then that she noticed the man in the corner of the store. He had been standing there since she had entered, observing everything with a look that seemed to carry more than mere curiosity. Tall, well-dressed, appearing to be in his 50s, with features that showed a life marked by time. His eyes were fixed on her, but not with judgment. There was something different there. Karen felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't like drawing attention to herself, especially at such a fragile moment. She cleared her throat and turned to Mr. Davis. "Are you sure you can't offer a little more?" The man behind the counter sighed, as if he had expected this question. "It's a good price for a simple piece like this. If you want to try another store, feel free, but I don't think you'll get much more." Karen pressed her lips together, holding the necklace tighter. Desperation filled her chest. She needed this money, but she also knew that $500 wouldn't make any real difference. It was then that the stranger finally spoke. "It's too little for something so valuable." His voice was firm, but not rude. Karen turned around slowly, surprised to be approached by someone who wasn't part of the negotiation. The store owner raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms, but said nothing. Karen hesitated before replying, "I have no other choice. My son needs treatment. He has a difficult illness, and I need the money." The man nodded slightly, as if he already knew that. He took a step forward, keeping his posture relaxed, but with a watchful eye. "Even if you accept this money, it will still be far from what you need, won't it?" She felt a lump in her throat. He was right, and hearing it from a stranger only made everything seem even more desperate. "I don't see any other alternative," he replied, his voice coming out almost as a whisper. The man took a deep breath, as if fighting an internal thought, before finally speaking. "Maybe I can help." Karen frowned. She didn't know who he was, and the last thing she wanted was to depend on the kindness of a stranger. "Who are you?" He held out his hand, offering a business card. "My name is Tom Reynolds." She took the card hesitantly, without looking away from him. The name sounded familiar, but her mind was too busy to remember where. "And why do you want to help me?" Tom looked away for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Because I've been in your shoes." Karen felt a shiver run across her skin. There was something in the way he said it, a weight to his words that suggested he understood much more than he was willing to admit at that moment. She gripped the card tighter, still reluctant. "I can't accept charity." Tom tilted his head slightly, appraising her. "It's not charity, it's a choice. You can keep trying to find a solution on your own, or accept help from someone who knows what they're doing." She bit her lower lip, feeling trapped. Trusting strangers had never done her any good, but what else could she do? The store owner cleared his throat, looking impatient with the situation. "So, are you going to sell or not?" Karen looked at the necklace one last time, reliving all the memories associated with it. Her mother, her past, her history, and now, her cruel present. She took a deep breath and returned the necklace to the small box, closing it gently. "No." The store owner just shrugged. "As you wish." Tom watched as she put the necklace away in her handbag, saying nothing. Only when she turned to leave did he break the silence. "My address is on the card. If you decide to accept the help, look me up." Karen paused for a moment before leaving the store. Outside, the biting Detroit wind hit her face, bringing with it a chill that seemed to penetrate to her bones. She looked at the card one more time before squeezing it between her fingers. She didn't know if she could trust that man, but she also didn't know if she could afford to refuse his offer. And at that moment, any hope, no matter how small, was worth considering. The morning dawned with a dim light penetrating through the hospital windows as Karen walked through the silent corridors, trying to organize her thoughts. She made her way to the pediatric ward where Peter was staying. The corridor was decorated modestly, with information posters about care and procedures, and the distant sound of footsteps and conversations filled the room with a sense of contained urgency. She wondered if she was making the right choice in accepting help from a man she barely knew, but her son's situation urged her on. On arriving at the children's ward, Karen found Peter settled on a bed, his eyes closed and his breathing calm, an indication that the treatment was already beginning to have an effect. A nurse approached to check the boy's vital signs and, with an exhausted smile, she thanked him for his attention. As she watched her son, Karen felt a faint hope growing, although the shadow of despair was still present in her heart. She knew that every moment was precious and that, without the right treatment, Peter's condition could worsen again. Shortly afterwards, Karen was approached by Dr. Nicholson, who invited her to accompany him to a waiting room reserved for the patient's parents. There, amid uncomfortable chairs and a television showing the news at a low volume, she waited while the doctor discussed the next steps in the treatment with other professionals. It was in this atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty that Tom Reynolds reappeared. He was sitting in one of the chairs, wearing a well-cut suit that contrasted with the simplicity of the place. His gaze was calm, but he bore an expression of concern that seemed to understand Karen's distress. Tom stood up as soon as Karen approached, offering a firm handshake and a restrained smile. "Karen, thank you for accepting my help. I've already deposited a considerable amount in your account," he said in a low, assured voice. She just nodded, feeling her heart beat faster at his closeness. The conversation began shyly enough, with Tom asking about Peter's condition and Karen reporting, between restrained sobs, the small progress of the treatment. The hospital environment, with its constant buzz and the sound of equipment, served as a backdrop for a dialogue full of sincerity. As they walked down a side corridor together, Tom took the opportunity to open up a little more. "I know this is a difficult situation, Karen. I lost my daughter a few years ago to a very similar illness. I know what it's like to feel helpless in the face of pain and despair." Her voice was calm, but the emotion was in her eyes. Karen paused for a moment, absorbing the words. She had never imagined that someone so successful and self-assured could carry such a heavy burden. She replied in a trembling voice, "I feel like I'm alone in this struggle. The help you've offered. It's the first time I've seen someone really care about what I'm going through." Tom nodded slowly and continued, "The truth is that, for all these years, I've tried to isolate myself, to distance myself from everything and everyone. But seeing your courage, even in the face of so much suffering, has made me rethink my own life. I can't change the past, but I can do something to help now." As he spoke, he stared at Karen with a sincerity that disarmed her. She began to feel an unexpected connection, a momentary relief at having found someone who somehow understood the anguish of seeing a sick child. Sitting in a small rest area, they sipped coffee from the vending machine. The conversation flowed naturally, alternating between moments of silence and heartfelt conversations. Tom shared details about his daughter, the little memories of a childhood that no longer existed, and how every day without her was a painful memory. Karen, for her part, talked about her mother, the woman who taught her to be strong, and how that necklace was the last link she had with her. As she recounted the happy times they had spent together, Tom's eyes grew teary, and he murmured, "I understand this pain. Losing someone so important is like losing a part of yourself." Gradually, the conversation became more intimate, and the cold, impersonal atmosphere of the hospital was replaced by a feeling of mutual welcome. Karen began to relax, allowing Tom's empathy to soften the intensity of her despair for a moment. He offered words of comfort, but also reaffirmed his decision to help with Peter's treatment whenever necessary, something that had seemed unlikely to her until then. "I want to be part of this fight, Karen. I want Peter to have every chance of recovering, and I know that this help could be the first step towards that," he assured her with conviction. As the afternoon progressed, a nurse approached to report that Peter had shown signs of improvement. Karen stood up quickly, her face lit by a mixture of relief and concern. "I have to go and see my son," she said, excusing herself and promising to return soon. Tom accompanied her to Peter's room, showing genuine care. In the brief interval during which Karen watched her son rest, she allowed herself to believe that, at last, things might change. Trying to get the conversation going again, Tom commented, "You know, Karen, I've been involved in various initiatives to help people in difficult situations. My company, Reynolds Industries, has invested in social responsibility programs." The mention of the company's name made Karen's heart skip a beat. She stopped, staring at him. For an instant, her surroundings seemed to freeze. Her normally serene eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and disgust. "Reynolds Industries?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "Are you talking about the same company that, years ago, played a key role in the merger that destroyed the company my mother worked for, LW Industries?" The silence that followed was filled with incredulity. Tom remained motionless for a few seconds, his eyes wide with astonishment. He paused for a few seconds and looked briefly at the floor, as if weighing up every word he was about to say. Finally, in a low, remorseful voice, he replied, "Yes, Karen. I was part of that process. I never wanted to cause pain. But back then, decisions were made coldly, without considering the human impact. I struggle with that guilt every day." Karen stepped back, feeling a wave of betrayal and anguish run through her body. Memories of her mother and accounts of her professional experience came flooding back. "How can you say you didn't mean to cause pain? My mother lost her job and, with no resources for her treatment, she ended up dying. All that was the result of decisions you helped make," she accused, her voice shaking between anger and despair. Tom raised his hands in a gesture that was a mixture of regret and sadness. "I know that doesn't justify anything, Karen. I was trapped in a corporate logic that didn't consider people's feelings. Today, I'm not that man anymore. I'm trying in every way to make up for that mistake by doing something that can save lives." The weight of the words hung between them as Karen struggled to reconcile the help he was offering with the open wound of the past. Tom's every word seemed to bring up the pain she'd carried for years. "I don't know if I can forget what happened or if I'll ever be able to forgive him," she said softly, unable to hide the bitterness in her voice. Tom replied sincerely, "I don't expect you to forgive me now. I'm just asking you to consider what I'm trying to do to change. If I can help Peter, maybe that means I can somehow repair some of the harm I've caused." For a moment, silence took over again, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps and the murmurs of healthcare workers. Karen felt the tension rising in her chest, torn between the urgent need to save her son and the deep resentment that Tom's past aroused in her. Memories of her mother and the difficulties she had faced in order to survive were mixed with the fear of reliving old wounds. She looked at Tom, searching his eyes for some indication that he really felt genuine regret. "I'm trying to do the right thing now, Karen," Tom repeated, his voice firm but charged with emotion. "I know that my past actions can't be erased, but I can use what I've learned to prevent other people from suffering like your mother did. Peter deserves a chance, and I want to help ensure that." Karen remained silent for a long moment, while her face expressed a whirlwind of emotions. She knew that Tom's help was vital for Peter's treatment, but the emotional price of this alliance was too high. With watery eyes, she murmured, "I need time to think. It's all too much for me right now." Tom nodded slowly, without pressuring her. "I understand, Karen. Take all the time you need. I'll be here to answer your questions. No rush." As Karen stood up to return to Peter's room, the sound of a nurse calling out to her reminded her that, right now, her son's well-being was the priority. She took one last look at Tom, with an expression that mixed gratitude and pain, and said goodbye with a brief wave. On returning to the room, the atmosphere seemed to have taken on a new emotional charge. The treatment was beginning to have an effect, and Peter was showing signs of improvement. But the revelation about Reynolds Industries left Karen with a bitter feeling, as if the past was inescapably linked to the present. As she walked slowly towards the pediatric ward, thoughts crowded into her mind, and she wondered if she would ever be able to forgive the man who, even with intentions of redemption, carried the weight of an irreparable mistake. The day dawned grey, reflecting Karen's heavy mood. In the hospital corridor, where the sound of hurried footsteps and low conversations formed a constant soundtrack, she felt torn between gratitude for having her son receiving treatment and the intense anger boiling inside her. What had begun as a relief at accepting Tom Reynolds' help was now turning into a devastating internal conflict. The discovery that Tom had been part of the merger that had destroyed her mother's company was heartbreaking. Sitting in her parents' waiting room, Karen leafed through some of the loan papers and letters from charities that she had unsuccessfully sought in recent weeks. Each refusal seemed to increase the weight of her frustration. She had visited credit agencies and sought help in the community, but no one had been able to offer the amount needed for Peter's treatment. While she was rereading a denial letter from an assistance program, her cell phone rang. It was Tom. After a brief hesitation, she answered. His voice, calm and restrained, sounded on the other end of the line, but it couldn't alleviate the whirlwind of feelings that overwhelmed her. "Karen, we need to talk about what happened yesterday," said Tom, his tone a mixture of concern and regret. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Talk about how you suddenly appear and then turn out to be responsible for destroying my family's only source of security," she said, her voice shaking with restrained anger. On the other end, the line was silent for a few seconds. Karen could almost imagine Tom looking down, his shoulders slumped under the weight of guilt. "I know that my actions were due to moments of insensitivity," he replied slowly. "I can't change what happened, but I can try to explain what happened then. It was a decision made amid pressure and cold numbers. I never wanted to hurt your family." Karen closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the stories her mother had told her about the day everything changed. Tom's every word seemed to relive the pain of that past. "You talk about numbers and pressures, but you don't talk about people," she replied, her voice full of bitterness. "My mother was sacrificed in the process. She lost her job and, with no income, was unable to look after herself. After that, the treatment she needed was never possible. And now, here I am, trying to save my son's life, while you present yourself as if you want to help." Tom's voice trembled a little, revealing the internal conflict he had been carrying for years. "Karen, I struggle with this guilt every day. I was part of a machine that didn't see the human impact of its decisions. Ever since I lost my daughter, I've been trying to find a way to make amends, even if only minimally, for the harm I caused. I know it won't fix the past, but if I can help your son, maybe I can do something good with all this suffering." On the other end of the phone, Karen's silence was almost palpable. She hung up quietly. She picked up the papers she had brought with her and, her face marked by fatigue and pain, walked to the room where Peter was being admitted. There, the soft sound of a machine monitoring the boy's heartbeat contrasted with the turbulence in his heart. For a moment, she allowed herself to observe her son, who slept with a serene expression, oblivious to the whirlwind of conflicts his mother was facing. Later, after ensuring that Peter was stable, Karen decided that she needed to find answers for herself. She made an appointment with a financial advisor from a community organization that promised to help families in desperate situations. Sitting in a modest room with white-painted walls and worn chairs, she explained her situation. She explained that, despite her efforts to get loans and community support, the figures never matched the costs of her treatment. The advisor, in a restrained and professional tone of voice, explained that the options were limited for someone with her income and credit history. "Unfortunately, Karen, the institutions we have access to are unable to provide the amount needed for such urgent treatment. Have you tried seeking help from non-governmental organizations?" he asked, while jotting something down in a notebook. "Yes, I've tried. Every answer was negative, or an offer that didn't even cover half of what I need," she replied, her voice low and full of resignation. At that moment, the door opened and a colleague from the organization walked through, greeting the consultant informally. Karen got up, grabbed her bag with the papers, and left the room, the feeling of helplessness growing with every step she took through the corridors of the institution. She found herself at a dead end. torn between the desperate need to save her son and resentment towards a man who represented the source of so much pain in her past. Upon returning to the hospital, Karen found Tom sitting in a rest area where family members had gathered to wait. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the emptiness. She approached him, and the silence between them was heavy. "I need answers," she said, breaking the silence with a voice that oscillated between anger and sadness. "Why do you think I can accept your help after everything your company has done? You offer me this money, this support, but you can't change the fact that you were responsible for destroying what my mother built." Tom looked up, his eyes meeting hers intensely. "I know my words won't erase the past," he replied, his voice breaking. "But Karen, I'm trying to do something now that can make up, even in the smallest way, for all the harm I've caused. If I can help Peter, if I can do something good with the remorse I carry, maybe it will mean something." She shook her head, her eyes full of tears that threatened to fall. "I don't know if I can accept your help without feeling like I'm betraying my mother's memory," she replied, her voice full of pain. "Every time I look at that necklace, I remember her love and sacrifice, and now, having to accept it from you, from someone who was part of it all, it's too much for me." Tom remained silent for a few moments, letting her words sink in. The distant sound of a heart monitor and the murmur of the nurses filled the space as he tried to find the right words. "Karen, I don't expect you to forgive me or forget what happened," he continued, choosing each word carefully. "All I ask is that you consider what's best for Peter. He is receiving treatment that, without my help, might never have begun. And if there's anything I can do to save a life, I will, even if the price is my own peace." She took a step back, as if she needed space to breathe. Her face was marked by the internal struggle between the desire to protect her son and the need to honor the past. Karen turned, looking down the corridor, but without completely turning away from Tom. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice low and almost inaudible. "But don't expect me to forget what you did. My mother's pain won't go away, and I don't know if I can live with it." Tom tilted his head, showing the sadness he felt. He knew that the scars of the past ran deep, and that reconciliation would not come easily. As the minutes slowly passed, Karen went off to visit Peter, leaving Tom alone in that rest area. That afternoon, as the sunlight tried to seep through the high windows of the hospital, Karen felt the weight of the choices ahead of her. She searched in vain for an alternative that didn't involve accepting Tom's help. She contacted the loan agency again and tried calling other organizations. But all the answers were negative or vague promises that didn't materialize. Every phone call was a bitter reminder that, on her own, she wouldn't be able to pay for her son's treatment. Sitting on a bench in the hospital courtyard, Karen mentally went over each refusal. The consultant's words echoed in her mind, and the feeling of helplessness grew with each missed call. In the midst of this despair, the image of the gold necklace, shiny and heavy with her mother's memories, came to mind. It was a symbol of everything she had lost and everything she was fighting to preserve. But accepting Tom's help meant somehow betraying that memory. At the end of the day, as the hospital began to empty its corridors and the constant noise turned into a distant murmur, Karen knew she had to make a decision. But that night, as she listened to the sound of Peter's monitor and felt the cold of the room mingle with the warmth of her tears, she found no consolation. All she had was the uncertainty of whether her love for her son would be enough to overcome the bitterness of the past, and whether somehow she would be able to move on without feeling that she was sacrificing her mother's memory. The afternoon dragged silently through the hospital as Karen stood in the waiting room, watching the slow movement of the other parents and relatives. She tried unsuccessfully to find some solace in the low conversations and the distant sound of the nurses' hurried footsteps. Her thoughts revolved around Peter, whose improvement had been the only hope that had sustained her faith since Tom had approached. However, her sense of security began to crumble when her cell phone rang urgently. Karen answered without hesitation. On the other end of the line, a nurse's trembling voice informed her that Peter had taken a sudden turn for the worse, and that his condition had become critical. The news hit her like a blow. She felt her world spinning. Her racing heart and shortness of breath left her almost unable to formulate words. Peter has been transferred to the pediatric ICU, and the doctors are doing everything they can to stabilize him. He had a sudden worsening, perhaps an adverse reaction to some medication. "We don't know yet," said the nurse in a restrained manner, but with undeniable concern. The words hovered in her mind as tears welled up, mixing with the despair that threatened to overflow. Without wasting any time, she left the waiting room and ran down the cold, narrow corridors of the hospital. The sound of hurried footsteps and closing doors echoed like a reminder of the urgency of the moment. On the way to the ICU, her thoughts ran to Tom, the man who, despite all the weight of his past, had shown himself willing to help Peter. Her pride, which until then had insisted on keeping an emotional distance, began to give way in the face of the paralyzing fear of losing her son. With no other alternatives, Karen felt she had to seek Tom's support again. As they approached a small rest area near the entrance to the ICU, Karen spotted Tom asking a nurse for information. She approached with faltering steps, anger and fear mixing in her voice as she tried to contain her emotions. "Tom, I need to talk to you now," she said, her voice full of pain and determination. Tom looked at her, a worried expression replacing any trace of indifference. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the heavy silence of the corridors enveloped them. "Karen, what's wrong?" he asked, his sincere but tense tone revealing the seriousness of the situation. With her voice breaking and her eyes watering, she broke the news that had shaken her to the core. Peter suddenly got worse. "The nurse called me to say that he's in critical condition and has been transferred to the pediatric ICU." Her words came out almost as a whisper, full of panic and despair. Tom's features hardened momentarily, but soon softened into compassion. He took a step forward, approaching with a firm posture, as if to convey security through his presence. "Karen, I will do whatever it takes to save you. I'm not here to seek forgiveness for what happened, but to really help. I know you have reasons to hate me, and I don't expect that to change overnight. But please, think of Peter," he said, his voice low and charged with restrained emotion. Karen hesitated, the internal conflict evident in her eyes. For a long time, she had held on to her pride and hurt, refusing the help that reminded her of the pain of the past. However, in that instant, the terror of losing Peter was stronger than any resentment. I don't know if I can accept your help, Tom," she murmured, her voice fluctuating between fury and fear. Tom moved even closer, keeping his gaze firm and gentle. "Karen, I don't expect you to forgive me or forget what happened. I know that what my company did was irreparable for your family, and that torments me every day. But right now, all that matters is Peter. He needs urgent treatment, and I'm willing to do anything to ensure that he receives the best possible care," he said slowly, each word laden with sincerity. The tears that had previously refused to fall now slid freely down Karen's face. She knew that, out of love for her son, she couldn't turn down any chance to save him, even if it meant accepting help from someone who had hurt her deeply. "It's not that I've forgotten what you did, or that I've forgiven you," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "It's that Peter means everything to me, and if this help is what can give him a chance, then I have no choice. I accept your help, Tom." There was a brief silence as Tom nodded, his eyes showing relief and a new determination. Without further ado, he suggested, "Come with me now. I'm already in contact with my private medical team, and I'll pass the case on to them, and they'll get in touch with the team here. I can speed up access to all the resources we need. Even if I have to send for medication abroad, we'll save you. We'll do everything we can to save your son." The two of them walked together down the corridor, lit only by fluorescent lights, where the sound of the monitors and the nurses' hurried footsteps formed the backdrop to a battle against time. Each step was a silent promise that, despite all the wounds of the past, at that moment, love and the desire to protect Peter were stronger than any wounded pride. As they approached the ICU door, Karen held Tom's hand for a brief moment, as if that touch could convey all the hope and despair contained in her heart. There was no more room for resentment or pride. The only way forward was to fight together for the son they had both somehow come to love. With intensive treatment underway, Peter was beginning to show signs of improvement, albeit timid. The doctors, cautious, indicated that the boy was responding well to the therapies, which brought temporary relief to Karen's heart. During the long hours spent in hospital, she found herself increasingly accompanied by Tom, whose presence, once full of tension and suspicion, now seemed indispensable for her to cope with everyday life. One Tuesday morning, as the sun struggled to break through the grey clouds outside, Karen stood beside Peter's bed. The room, decorated with children's drawings and simple toys, was a modest refuge where she found the strength to face another day of uncertainty. Tom approached slowly, as if afraid of interrupting the silence that had been established. He parked himself next to the armchair where Karen was leafing through a notebook, probably recording the doctor's recommendations and moments of hope. "Karen, I was thinking," Tom began, his voice calm but carrying a sincerity that he couldn't hide, "that perhaps we could talk a little about the future, not just about Peter, but about us too." Karen looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of weariness and curiosity. She knew that his every word now carried the weight of an attempt at redemption, but the scars of the past still throbbed painfully. "I still feel a lot of anger, Tom," she replied, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Every time I remember what happened to my mother, I feel like I'm carrying a burden that's impossible to ignore." Tom nodded, his eyes meeting hers in a gesture that sought to convey understanding. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I can never erase the pain I've caused your family, but looking at Peter and seeing the small progress he makes every day, I feel that I can somehow help other people. I've been learning that, although you can't rewrite history, you can decide how to live from now on." Those words hung in the air as Karen processed the message. Over the next few days, their daily interaction, whether it was during an appointment or while they were waiting for news in the waiting room, allowed the two of them to get closer in a natural way. In moments of silence, between the sounds of the monitors and the murmur of the health professionals' conversations, Karen noticed that her anger began to mix with a faint sense of understanding. Tom was no longer the man she had met during that first encounter at the pawn shop, but someone who was gradually showing genuine changes in his behavior and way of expressing himself. One afternoon, while Peter slept peacefully after a nap in the ward, the two of them retired to a quieter corridor in the hospital. They sat on a worn plastic bench where the fluorescent light seemed to soften the contours of their faces. Tom broke the silence. "Karen, I know words may seem inadequate, but I've been trying to help not just because of what you and Peter are going through, but because I'm trying to be a better person. Every day that passes makes me reflect on the consequences of my choices and how much I can and must change." Karen stared at him, evaluating every intonation. The memory of her mother was a constant ghost, but at that moment, the man in front of her showed a vulnerability that made her wonder if perhaps there was room for something other than hurt. "I still can't forgive what happened," she said, her voice firm but without any rancor. "But I can see that you're trying. And as Peter gets better, I have to believe that this attempt to change can somehow be real." Tom inclined his head in agreement and silence. For a few moments, time seemed to slow down as they both reflected on the complexity of the feelings involved. Living together every day and working together to ensure the best treatment for Peter created an unexpected bond where the painful past began to give way to a new perspective. The following week, during a routine visit, the doctor confirmed that Peter was making progress, although a full recovery still depended on time and continued care. While Karen listened to the doctor's explanations, Tom, sitting next to her, discreetly held her hand. The touch, brief and sincere, spoke more than words could express in that environment marked by hope and uncertainty. When they left the hospital that afternoon, while a private nurse stayed with Peter, the atmosphere was milder. On the way back to the apartment where she needed to pick up some clothes, the two of them engaged in a practical conversation about the routine of caring for Peter, about the small improvements and the challenges that still lay ahead. The conversation, although punctuated by concerns, also revealed a growing partnership, where each began to accept that, despite the past, the present required collaboration. When they got home, Karen looked at Tom and said, with a look that mixed caution and a glimmer of gratitude, "I may never be able to forget completely, but I can try to move on, for Peter and for me." Tom just nodded, knowing that this statement was a step, however small, towards a possible reconciliation. At that moment, the journey to a better future seemed at least a little less lonely. Peter was finally about to be discharged, and the doctors confirmed that his recovery was proceeding at a satisfactory pace. In the pediatric ward, the atmosphere was already showing signs of change. The monitors showed stable heart rates, and the nurses' cautious smiles revealed optimism. Karen, sitting beside the bed where Peter was resting, watched her son with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew that this was the beginning of a new stage, but she also understood that the ghosts of the past were still with her. Later, in the corridor near the drawing room, Karen found Tom waiting. He was dressed simply, without the suit he wore on their first meeting, and his gaze showed the seriousness of someone who carried the weight of wrong choices. Without much ceremony, the two of them sat down on a plastic bench in the soft light that filtered through the hospital's large windows. "Today, the doctor said that Peter is recovering well," Karen began, her voice low but firm. "He may even go home soon. I feel immense joy, but also unease. All this fighting makes me rethink the future, not just my son's, but ours too." Tom took a deep breath and looked away for a moment, as if weighing up each word before uttering it. Tom held out his hand and Karen took it gently, as if that touch could seal a new alliance. He replied, "I ask you to let me stay by your side. That's all. Let me stay close to you. That first step is all I ask. I want to build something new with you, even if the scars of the past will never completely disappear. I promise that from now on, I will do everything in my power to be worthy of the trust you are placing in me." The conversation continued with the clarity of someone who understands that the future cannot be rewritten, but it can be shaped. Between sincere dialogues and moments of silence, they discussed practical plans, what the routine at home would be like, Peter's return to school, and even the possibility of turning what remained of the suffering into lessons for the future. Karen spoke of the difficulties she had faced during the months of treatment and the countless doors that had closed, while Tom explained, in a restrained voice, the commitment he was making to help financially and emotionally. Later, in a meeting with a hospital social worker, the two of them defined the next steps for Peter's discharge. Karen explained that, despite having made progress with his treatment, a definitive solution to his financial problems and the organization of his family life was still needed. Tom assured her that he would make every effort to help. The conversation was objective, without drama, and focused only on the family's real needs. In this pragmatic environment, the two realized that getting together would not just be a symbolic gesture, but a concrete way of facing the challenges of everyday life. When Peter was finally discharged, the family got together to mark this new phase. At the hospital exit door, with the setting sun painting the sky in warm tones, Karen and Tom walked side by side. In a brief moment of pause, Karen looked at Tom and, with eyes full of emotion, declared, "I feel now that I can forgive you. Choosing to move on with you, to look after Peter together, is what feels right to me." Tom, visibly moved, replied, "Then let's take that first step. I don't promise to erase the past, but I do promise to be a better man every day. If you let me, we'll build a future together, facing every challenge as a team." That touch of hands, that shared look, he kissed her deeply. In the days and weeks that followed, their relationship deepened naturally. Tom began to help with the household chores, accompanied Peter on his activities, and gradually became an indispensable presence in the family's life. Karen and he learned to deal with the remnants of the hurt, finding in the small daily victories the motivation to move on. Months later, in a simple and intimate ceremony, surrounded by friends and family who witnessed them overcoming adversity, Karen and Tom were officially united in marriage. During the vows, between sincere words and glances that spoke more than any promise, Karen admitted, with a shaky voice, that total forgiveness might never come, but that this first step was enough to rewrite their story. Tom, with restrained tears, reaffirmed his commitment to being not just a partner, but a devoted father to Peter. As they left the ceremony site, hand in hand, the three of them moved on to a new chapter in their lives. The past, with all its wounds, could not be erased,